Hello, welcome back to a new episode of Ancient History 101. With me, your host, Alexandra Sills. And today we have an episode just in time for Disability Pride Month. I did promise everyone, didn't I, that when I started this podcast, we weren't going to just talk about Greece and Rome. And this is our first foray in going a bit further than those borders. For the discussion today, I have a very, very special expert guest who also happens to be a friend of mine, I'm proud to say. Would you like to introduce yourself for everyone?
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra. My name is also Alexandra. I'm Dr. Alexandra Morris. I'm currently a lecturer education and ancient history at Queen's University Belfast, but it's a one-year post, so I don't know where I will be next year. I have cerebral palsy, and to give a visual description of myself, I am a white woman with brown curly-ish hair, blue-pink glasses, and today I'm wearing a red rose kind of top with a pink top underneath that, and one rose earring and a rose necklace. The reason why I have one rose earring is I unfortunately tore my ear in January. I can't wear earrings in the other ear. Besides that, I'm very active in the museum sphere. I'm currently president of the Museum Education Roundtable, which publishes the Journal of Museum Education, and I am also one of the co-presidents of Print Antiquity, which is an advocacy group for deaf, disabled, and neurodivergent people in ancient world studies.
Fantastic. So you are definitely the person to ask about this topic because we're going to be talking about disability in the ancient Egyptian world. We've already spoken, listeners might remember our discussion with Debbie Sneed talking about disability in ancient Greece. And what I learned from that discussion is going to very much inform my first question. Because when I asked her what's the most common question, she actually said, were there disabled people in ancient Greece? Which blew my mind because I thought that would be a fairly safe assumption to say yes. So just to make sure, were there people with disabilities in the ancient Egyptian world?
I'm going to say wholeheartedly yes. We see them in abundance in various contexts, and we can talk about that. And just to also clarify, I am technically an Egyptologist, but my specialty is Ptolemaic Egypt, so I'm familiar with Greece and Egypt, so I'm happy to do a cross-comparative talk today.
Just so that we can refresh everyone's memories. What do we mean in the modern term when we say disability?
Okay, I'm going to refer to the definition that's found in a Vogel and Power article from 2023, which I think is one of the most clear definitions of what disability I've found, especially when referring to archaeological context. It's a complex and in some contexts constructed category, which can include congenital and acquired bodily differences. So differences that you're born with or differences that you acquire later in life. Chronic and acute illnesses, mental illnesses, and cognitive conditions, i.e. neurodiversity, progressive and fatal diseases, temporary and permanent injuries, and even a range of physical characteristics that can be considered, quote, disfiguring from uncommon proportions to scars or birthmarks, end quote.
So in modern society, then, I think it's fair to say that more people are disabled than we assume.
Yes, very much so.
So that definition is interesting, isn't it? Is that how ancient Egyptians understood the definition of disability, or did they define it at all?
They did seem to have an understanding of bodily difference to a certain extent, and I argue in my own research that they defined it in terms of the concept known as ma'at, and order, and that which is chaos. So they saw disability as being part of the kind of natural order of things and the natural part of the universe. And they recognized that there were certain differences. So I do say that I think they did have a category of disability, although it's not necessarily the same as what we have today.
Okay, so we should, going forward, just bear that in mind, that what we say is a disability is not necessarily the same. Okay, that's really important right from the off. Okay, good. I'm glad we cleared that up. Whenever we see disability, and bearing in mind that a lot of people engage with the ancient world through pop culture, we're used to, aren't we, when we see historical fiction in novels, movies, disability is always really negatively portrayed. We're usually seeing outcasts forced to live on the fringes of society, reduced to poverty. We're told that historical disabled people are poor, often being made the butt of the joke. Is this an accurate representation of ancient Egyptian society?
I would say by and large, in Egypt, and again, we'll get into this, we see disabled people represented at basically all levels of society in Egypt, from kings all the way down to poor people and everything in between.
So really, the kind of image that we've got in our heads of disabled people pushed to the edge and are always poor, that's something that we've invented, right? Because that's not even true of modern society.
Exactly, yes.
So we can immediately get rid of that idea out of our head. Fantastic. So when we do put those misconceptions to the side, where, as a scholar, are you looking for a more accurate representation? Where are you getting your information? What kind of sources do you use when you use all of this information?
Okay. It's actually great because we have a variety of sources that we can look at, and we can actually cross compare things sometimes. So we are looking at a combination of text, artworks, and actual bodies, which is amazing because in ancient Egypt, as we know, they had mummification. In some cases, disabled bodies that we can then study medically, which is amazing.
That is an enviable amount of sources, and from a whole different amount of periods as well.
Yes, we have things dating all the way back in some instances to the pre-dynastic period, which is like roughly 4000 BCE, all the way up to Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, which is from about 323 BCE onwards. So all the way up into Roman Egypt, which is the first century CE.
So thousands of years.
Yes.
A whole heap of sources. That's incredible. I wish I had that amount of information from my own studies. When we spoke to Debbie, she was talking about the myth of ancient Greeks and their fondness for eugenics, throwing babies off of cliffs. And she told us that we do have a load of information that tells us that that wasn't true and eugenics wasn't much of an issue, actually. Is this something that is a myth when we look at Egyptians in pop culture? Do we see ideas of Egyptians rejecting disabled people at birth?
Okay, this is an interesting question. I would say in pop culture overall, no. I think the general consensus in pop culture is just disabled people didn't exist. So we're not even in that, I would say. I will say in movies like Gods of Egypt, there is a tendency to portray disabled gods who are disabled as being non-disabled, which is interesting.
Okay.
So it just kind of gets erased entirely and not really thought about, rather than there being this eugenics idea.
And Gods of Egypt, that's a Ridley Scott film, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, right, okay. What about in real ancient Egypt? Do we see ideas of eugenics being promoted at any point?
We really don't. They seem to have taken the opposite approach, and this seems to be steady to the point where we get all the way, once we get into the Greek era and later, writers like Herodotus going, the Egyptians are weird. They don't kill their children and they raise all of them. What's going on here with
Right.
this?
Okay, so is it fair to say then, now that I've spoken to you and Debbie, and you're both telling me that this isn't really happening, is this an instance where we've got a fairly modern idea that has grown so embedded in modern society that we're kind of retroactively grafting it back onto the ancient world because we assume it's good, we like the ancient world, the bits that we've stolen from it, so they must have been doing it as well?
I think in that case, yes. And I think this is also a case of us retroactively perhaps wanting to argue that we are better as a society today than they were back then. It's this idea of, oh, of course we've made progress in our treatment of disabled people today. And of course it was worse off, so that way we can feel better about ourselves as a society with how, honestly, and I forgive me, can I curse on the show? Shit, we're treating disabled people today.
Right.
And it'd be like, oh, okay, at least it wasn't, it's not as bad as it was back then. But when that's not actually the case.
So we are trying to make them look worse to feel better about ourselves instead of just being better ourselves.
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, that's depressing. Let's talk about medicine, because people need medicine. Everyone needs medicine, not just this section of society. How much did Egyptian doctors know about disabilities? Do we know whether they had any treatments that we might even say, yeah, that makes sense, even with all of our modern knowledge?
Okay, in terms of medicine, what we have is interesting. We do have them using certain herbs and certain plant materials to treat things like paralysis, potentially blindness to a certain degree, but only if it's acquired blindness from what we can see. And the other thing to understand about the Egyptians is they believed in medicine, but they also believed in religious practices. So you kind of use both. And to
Right.
them, religion was medicine. So I just want to highlight that. But what we don't see, which is really fascinating, is they don't see conditions like dwarfism as something that you treat. It's just an accepted natural order of things. So we don't have any evidence of them trying to treat things like that in their medical record.
So whereas we might look at something and think that needs fixing,
Yes.
they don't say the same
There's
thing.
nothing in about it in there, basically.
Okay.
But they do recognize that there are certain things that do need treatment, again, like acquired blindness, like certain types of paralysis, injuries, etc.
Can we see in the archaeological record, can we see anything like mobility aids that, again, we might look at and think, yeah, I recognize that. We use a version of that now.
Yes, the ancient Egyptians had prosthetics.
Huh.
So, yes, and we know from, and it's studies that have been done on some of them. We have examples of toe prosthetics. We also have examples of arm prosthetics, and we also have examples of leg prosthetics in some instances. We know from examinations of the toe prosthetics that these were functional and used during life in some instances.
That's really interesting.
And we also have them at levels or price points. I assumed that you could, if you were richer, you could get a higher quality one. And if you were poorer, you could get a lower quality one. We have ones that are made out of cartonnage, which are basically paper mache, that are a lower quality one. And then we have an example of a really fancy one that is made out of wood with leather straps. Fascinating. And if you want to know where these are currently, there are two examples of toe prosthetics in the British Museum.
Mm-hmm.
There is an example of a woman with an arm prosthetic in the Durham Oriental Museum. And there is another example, I'm not sure where, of a woman who had both of her legs amputated and then had, in the afterlife, they made her leg prosthetics to put on her mummy to take with her to the afterlife, essentially.
So do these prosthetics, are they made to look like the missing parts?
Yes, they are. They are very, very much so. With the wooden one, it's literally, it looks like a toe. They even have the little toenail on the top, so that way you can look and it would look like a toe, essentially.
Wow. Okay. So they're paying attention to aesthetics as well as it being usable.
Yes. For the most part, yes. At least with the toe prosthetics. With the arm prosthetics, we don't know if those were actually used in life or not, unfortunately, and that's due to the condition where this was found, or what they, unfortunately, scientists did and archaeologists did to the mummified remains after they were found back when they found them. The Durham mummy, what they did, which is unfortunate, is when they found her, they looked at her arm and they're like, let's try and take this off.
Right.
And they can't reattach it now. So it's in with her on display next to her body.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. But from what we know from her, which is interesting, and she's from the Ptolemaic period, which is, again, when Greeks came and took over Egypt, What we know from her is she seems to have been born without one of her arms, so this was an add-on, but we're not sure if she used it during her lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the toe prosthetics, that was an acquired injury where people lost their toes and then were added on and were made to be functional. So we see both things going on here. Have in terms of mobility is we have canes.
Fantastic.
We have canes in various as well, and we see these depicted both on art and in terms of the actual canes, and we'll get to this a little bit later when we talk about Tutankhamun. But in terms of other examples that we have, there is a 5th dynasty mummified man who's currently at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. He had one leg that was about 6 inches shorter than the other one, and they buried him in his sarcophagus with the cane so he could use it in the afterlife. So we have him. We also have, in terms of artwork, the stele of the doorkeeper Roma, who is shown utilizing a cane. He again had one leg where the musculature was weaker than the other one, and it's visibly weaker. It's like an atrophied leg, and he's leaning on a cane for support as he's praying to the goddess Astarte to bring basically benefits to his family. And he's shown with his entire family on the stele.
So at certain points in the ancient world, we are seeing art in a very idealized way then. And I'm definitely thinking, I mean, I've spoken to Mike Beer about Augustus and the statue at Prima Porta that shows him very tall, very muscular at the prime of life. And then Mike told me he was quite a weedy guy and quite old at this point. So art can sometimes lie to us. But what you're saying here is that they weren't trying to hide anything. They weren't trying to idealize themselves.
To a degree, no. And from what we see, and if you talk to other Egyptologists, they will say, yes, of course, the Egyptians were trying to idealize themselves. But what we are seeing time and time again in terms of the Sable people is that they aren't. And they are portrayed as having these limb differences. They are portrayed as having various physical differences in the art. And we see this in continuity from the pre-dynastic period all the way up again until the Roman period. So this is over thousands of years. The Roman period, I just do want to highlight another example of a mobility aid that we see from the Greco-Roman period. We think that this was found in Alexandria, and this is also currently located in the British Museum. It is a little statuette of a child. We don't know the child's gender, unfortunately, because of the clothing and hairstyle. But they are shown using a 3-wheeled walker.
Like a Zimmer frame.
Yes, pretty much. And this is great. This was identified originally by disability advocate Keith Armstrong, but unfortunately now deceased, as being a possible disabled child. I looked at this during my doctoral research and confirmed this. It seems to be, not to retroactively diagnose anything, but it seems to be an older child who has cerebral palsy based on the posture and musculature. If you look very closely at this kid who is using this as a mobility aid. This is fascinating because it is a mold-made piece. So this was produced for mass consumption for whatever reason. We don't know why. And I argue that the reason why we don't know the child's gender is you could get it painted and customized to be whatever you wanted.
Aha. So you're buying the basic terracotta shape and then you can add details to it afterwards to personalize it. Wonderful.
Yes.
Okay, that's incredible then. So we are definitely seeing already through the art that this is an accepted part of life.
Yes.
It's nothing to be ashamed of or to feel shame about, which I think is important for us to think about. So let's talk about quality of life when we're talking about the shame that we might expect ancient Egyptians to feel. Were ancient Egyptians with disabilities ever barred from taking an active role in society, or were they marginalized in the kind of way that we might expect Egyptians to marginalize people with disabilities?
All right, from what we see from this, the answer seems to be no, but again, depending upon which source you look at, the answer may be that maybe this was a little bit mixed back then.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why I'm going to say no to start off with is, again, when we look at art and we look at text and we look at everything else, we, for the most part, see disabled people being integrated into various aspects of everyday life. We have them as musicians, we have them as priests, we have them as pharaohs, we have them as workers on the pyramids. We have them as doorkeepers, as we saw with Roma. We have them pretty much everywhere. The evidence, however, that says maybe things were a little bit weird at this is we do have a couple of textual sources. One is from the Roman period, and I forget what the man's name is, but I know that Jane Draycott has written an article on him where he is complaining to various officials about constantly being harassed and people trying to take over his farm. And he's saying because he's visually impaired.
Right.
But he keeps writing these letters to them and complaining. So it seems that they are either taking him somewhat seriously, or he feels that he has the gumption to complain and that they will actually do something about this. In an earlier time period, and this again can be read two different ways, we have what are known as the instructions of Amenope, which date, these are basically wisdom literature that it's a hieratic text. We think it dates to about the 12th dynasty, which is the oldest example of this. But basically what we have on this is the instructions. I'll read it to you and explain what these are. Do not laugh at a blind man, nor tease a man with dwarfism, nor cause hardship for the lame. Do not tease a man who is in the hands of the god, nor be angry with him for his failings. Man is clay and straw, the god is his builder. He tears down, he builds up daily. He makes 1,000 for by his will. He makes 1,000 men into chiefs, for he, the god, is in his hour of life. Happy is he who reaches the west, and he is safe to the hands of the gods. Now, what these are wisdom literature, and what these basically are doing is instructions from a man to his son on how to live a good life. So you can take this phrase and the fact that he's telling his son, like, don't do this, don't be like bad to disabled people, maybe means that there is some societal expectation that this is going on, but it's not good to do. So that is another example of mixing, but that's what we have for that, basically.
That does sound slightly familiar to modern society, doesn't it? Because for all of our civilization that we say are civilized, there are certain members of society who are often pretty hostile towards people with disabilities. There are assumptions about faking it or accusing people of being work shy or being reluctant to provide accommodations. So we possibly are seeing certain people being hostile. But it's by no means everybody.
It seems the societal norm is not to be, because he's telling his son not to do this, essentially.
Okay. So that
makes sense.
That's interesting. So we can kind of recognize that kind of warning.
Yes.
To be kind.
Yeah. And again, this very much depends upon where you are in Egypt's history, too. If you get into the Ptolemaic period, and this is my hypothesis I proposed with my doctorate, and again in my first book, what I am arguing we are seeing in Ptolemaic Egypt, which is fascinating, that I don't think anyone else has put together, is we are seeing disabled war veterans being put in charge of things on an economic, social, and religious level.
Okay.
Through policies that the Ptolemies are doing, where they are giving these men land grants to have them come to Egypt and move to Egypt and settle in Egypt, and also ensuring themselves a new military class by saying, if we give you this land, then your sons have to serve in the military going forwards, which then creates another class of disabled war veterans and repeats the cycle.
Okay. So there is a kind of definite policy of looking after people.
To the degree, and they got this to connect back to Greece, Alexander the Great and his father Philip had started this, and they just kind of take this policy and amplify it, which is fascinating.
Okay. We've spoken about people potentially being slightly hostile, which again, we see in modern society. What I also see in modern society in discourse, particularly with the culture wars of the current moment, there's always something that's being used to create discussion, arguments. And in our current world, we see people perhaps pushing back against this because they have sympathy, but that sympathy comes out as pity. And it's saying, I sympathize because this is a bad thing. And it's not necessarily productive. It's kind of infantilizing, isn't it? Can we see this kind of Egyptian society where there are a number of people taking it upon themselves to feel bad for another person?
Thinking of their list question. Again, apart from what we can see, and I'm saying no here because we don't really have any evidence of that happening from what I know of, in that it just doesn't exist.
Right.
From what we have from our evidence, we see disabled people being taken care of in the afterlife in terms of preparations. We see them working and, quote unquote, and this is a horrible thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, being useful to society in various employment opportunities in Egypt. We don't really see anything in textual evidence or otherwise where people are like, oh no, the poor disabled person, we should not have them do things or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's another interesting point to make, isn't it? Because I think the modern assumption that pity comes because we feel bad for someone without ever asking, well, do you feel bad? Should I be feeling bad if you don't? So it's interesting that seems to be missing. I mean, we're pretty terrible at assuming that everyone with a disability, if they could, would choose to be what we call normal, because we think that it's a problem that needs to be fixed. So for disabled people in Egypt, can we see, I don't know, prayers to a god, will you please fix me? Or someone saying, I wish I was born normal. What is normal in Egypt?
This is an interesting question. And as a disabled person, very much relate to everything you just said. And that's this assumption that, yeah, I want to totally be cured of my cerebral palsy. No, I don't. In Egypt, again, we have this weird dichotomy. We do have various ostraca and prayer texts from like the Temple of Amun, where people have had acquired blindness where they're like, please fix me. I don't want to be blind. Why are you making me blind? You see that. What we don't see is, again, in terms of disabilities that you're born with, any of that going on.
Right.
So there seems to be this very much distinction between, if you have acquired something, then the expectation is, please fix me. But if you're born with something, there does not appear to be that expectation. They see it instead, again, and perhaps as being part of this idea of ma'at, or it's part of the natural order of things, and therefore it should be that. I'm referring back to the wisdom text. God is, what was the exact quote? Sorry. Man is clay and straw, the God is his builder. So therefore, God Kanum made you on his potter's wheel, and he made you how you're supposed to be. So therefore, you're how you're supposed to be, and you shouldn't want to cure in that case.
Okay. Now, you have used the term, and I'm glad you put the quotes around it, useful to society.
Mm-hmm.
And we do kind of measure worth in society by how productive someone can be. In ancient Egyptian society, were people with disabilities able to have careers, not just because they were expected to be productive, but because they were capable and found it intellectually fulfilling?
I think, again, there's a combination of both things going on, depending upon the disability type. You see people, again, with blindness or who are partially sighted with visual impairments who are appearing in artwork as musicians, which is something, if you have a visual impairment, you can totally do. We also see people with dwarfism working in various capacities, but they might have been limited by what they could do in certain cases because either the king really liked them, so they made them part of the official palace in certain roles, or they maybe inherited things we don't know. We see this in the example of, there's examples of people with dwarfism in the Old Kingdom. It's Seneb. is the main one, who was a high priest of the pharaoh Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. So we have him performing at Khufu's funeral.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a high priest. We also see other people with dwarfism working as servants, which again, maybe because that was a job that was open to them at the time, because we like potentially to have people with dwarfism as servants because they were linked to the gods, and we'll get to that in a little bit. They were therefore thought very highly. So if you have a whole bunch of them as your servants, this is great. You're very prestigious. We also see people with dwarfism working as wardrobe assistants to the king, pyramid workers, etc. So we see them at various levels.
Okay. And this isn't just because, pressure to make yourself productive. This is because it's just a part of life that everyone can take part in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Do we see any accommodations being made so that people with disabilities can join the workforce?
To a certain degree, again, yes. What we see here, again, going back to the musician's example, you don't need to see them be able to play music. What we also have in terms of artwork, and I forget where this tomb is, but this is a fascinating example, is we see a bunch of people going out and surveying land. And we have potentially what might be a man with blindness or a blind man who is a land surveyor who is being led around. He has his head on a little boy, his hand on a little boy's head, who's leading him around in the field on one side, and he has a rope stretched out on the other side. So it seems between the two of the things, he's helping to survey the land, but he's also having that aid to get around too, in the form of a mobility assistant or sighted guide in that case. Again, we see various examples of servants and things like that with canes and other mobility aids. I don't know if that's necessarily an accommodation or not, but we also see from the poorer end of society, people perhaps self-medicating,
Okay.
quote unquote, with alcohol. We have an example of a man who had, also from the death ray at Oasis, who died, we think, according to Dr. Michael Zimmerman, who's a paleopathologist, from cirrhosis of the liver. And his theory was, well, maybe he's self-medicating with alcohol because he can't afford the high-quality pain relief meds, so alcohol.
Okay. So if someone was richer, what kind of pain relief could they receive if they had chronic pain?
We know that they use lotuses to relieve chronic pain. So you would have high quality plants, opium poppies, opium lotuses, potentially marijuana.
Okay.
Yes. We have, drugs. And you could also get your religious stuff too in the form of amulets and other things.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that interesting because I've used medicinal marijuana and it's just, that connection. So we've kind of touched on it a little bit already, particularly with veterans. I think it's really important for everyone to remember, isn't it, that anyone can become disabled at any point. If you were born able-bodied, that's not necessarily how everything is going to go until the day that you die. So for people who became disabled in the ancient world for various reasons, what kind of help could they ask for, receive, or was this something that you were expected to deal with yourself?
I think in terms of Egypt, it is more something that you were expected to deal with yourself. Again, that shifts once we get into the later Greek and Greco-Roman period, where we again have these active, societal interventions of, oh, you've been disabled by war, please come settle here. Mm-hmm. But in terms of earlier things, we basically see them either trying to get treatment, as we saw with the Ostraka prayer from the Temple of Amun, where they're going to these religious sites and going to the god and going, please cure me of my blindness, please do anything else. But we also do have examples of doctors performing things. Again, we get us from various tomb inscriptions and artwork where they're doing things like performing eye surgery and things like that. So there is this medical understanding too that you need to go potentially get things, if that makes sense, if you can, or if you want to, and not necessarily any kind of welfare state.
Okay. So that's, one of the hot button topics right now, isn't it? Is who should be paying for medical care? So this is something that you would have to be able to afford medical care. This isn't doctors working out of the goodness of their hearts.
No. I would say no, and we see this also again in the example of the prosthetics, where we get prosthetics of various qualities, and again, the theory behind that is you pay for what you pay.
Okay. When we were speaking to Debbie, she suggested that disability was such a, an everyday part of Greek society that they were absolutely comfortable with having a deity who had a disability. Egypt is also, a huge pantheon of gods, huge diversity of deities. Can we see any disability in their gods?
Yes, we have multiple gods with disabilities in ancient Egypt. They are Bes, who is a god with dwarfism, Tychos, who is also a god with dwarfism, and in my own original research, I also argue that Harpocrates, who's a form of the god Horus, is also disabled and has cerebral palsy as well. What is fascinating about them, and I'll run through each of them so that way we can get to this. Bes was a protective deity, and he was basically, he's a protector of households, and in particular mother's children and childbirth. So he's a protective deity, and he again has dwarfism. Tychos is another protective deity who has dwarfism. He's a form of the god Ptah, who is associated there to the kind of craftsman god. So we see kind of a parallel to the Hephaestus. But again, he is protective. He is represented exclusively in the form of little protective amulets, so the wearer would wear to protect from evil and chaos, i.e. that force of that. And then with Harpocrates, he is also very much a protective deity. And he, more specifically, is the kind of later Greco-Roman god or form of Horus, who is the god of silence, secrets, confidentiality, and again, a protective god. So all these are gods with positive associations, and they were also used in healing contexts.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah, they're disabled and associated with healing, which is fascinating.
Because I'm thinking back to, being dragged to Sunday school as a kid, and the Christian God is a perfect God and we are all in his image. That's not what we're seeing in Greece or Egypt. We're seeing that it's the negative connotation, doesn't it? It just disappears as soon as you see a deity who doesn't look what we would consider now to be perfect and ideal.
No. Not at all. And what's really fascinating about them, too, is the form of Harpocrates and Bes have both a male and a female form. So they're not even the same gender all the time either.
Wow, okay. So that completely turns everything about what we consider ideal on its head.
Yes.
It's all just a matter of perspective.
Yes, very
Fantastic.
much so. And just to add on a little bit with that, with this two genders thing, what is really interesting is that Bes and Harpocrates are often appear together again in the healing context. But when they do, what we see is that it's only their male form. For whatever reason, the female forms don't appear together and they're in those healing contexts. So it's something I'm still working through in my research why that is, but it to have a very specific gender connotation there.
Whilst you've touched on gender, let's talk about families, because even now we hear constantly in discussions about family planning to avoid disabilities or to prevent disabilities being passed on, etc., which is, again, coming back to the eugenics. Do we see in ancient Egypt people with disabilities having families and they're not keeping this in mind? I can't have children because I don't want to pass on this.
We do not see that at all, essentially. We see, again, in terms of integration, disabled people marrying non-disabled people and having kids. We see this with Roma's family, where he's married to a non-disabled wife and they have kids. We see this with Seneb, who is the man with dwarfism, who was married and had at least 3 kids to 2 non-disabled wives. And what's really fascinating about Seneb, too, is his name in ancient Egyptian means healthy. So his parents or whoever looked at him, saw that he had dwarfism, and it's like, yep, we're naming you healthy.
Fantastic. I really want this discussion to get people thinking about how we approach disability in modern society and showing a different way of thinking and a different way of building our society with all the kinds of people in it that there always have been, right? Because this is something that previous societies have always had to deal with, and we could actually be taking quite a lot of positive advice from them. Now, we can't really discuss disability in ancient Egypt without mentioning Tutankhamun, because for most people, if they've heard of one Egyptian with a disability, it's going to be him. He is so famous. Can you tell us a little bit more about his lived experience and how scholars and archaeologists have been able to work out what impairments he had and how they were treated, accommodated, what his lived experience was?
Yes, of course. And I'm going to start out by prefacing this with saying Tutankhamun is still very controversial, and you will have Egyptologists who are still in the mentality of, no, he wasn't the, he was the perfect man. How dare you say he was stable?
Right, okay.
That being said, and this again has been determined at various points through a combination of actual medical scans of his body, as well as looking at evidence from his tomb, we think at this point that he might have had club foot, which is where your foot kind of turns and bends at a weird angle.
Mm-hmm.
Kohler's disease, which basically causes bone death in your foot and is quite painful. Possible scoliosis. This is more controversial, and there were some Egyptologists who will be like, oh, he doesn't have this. This was an embalming mistake. That's why he has scoliosis.
Right.
I am not one of them who believe that. We also think he also might have had a mild cleft palate as well.
Okay.
So that's what we think he had. And we think he possibly died from an infected broken leg.
So that would have been incredibly painful.
Yes.
Do we see anything from his tomb that gives us a clue to how he was managing all of these conditions and his pain?
Yeah, this is again my research. This was an article that I published back in 2020. What I did was look, because at the time that the evidence about his disabilities was just coming out, and I was like, let's look at his tomb from a disability perspective and see what we can find there. We have various things in his tomb that point to disability if you are willing to look at them and actually see them and consider them. But again, not all Egyptologists are willing to. He was buried with over 131 walking sticks, some of which show signs of having been used during his life. One is referred in an inscription on it as being his favorite cane because he picked it from the beast himself.
Okay.
Yes. There are Egyptologists, however, who will say that no, this is just a sign of his status. He was king, so therefore he was an important figure, not mobility.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
I mean, if it's showing signs of wear, then...
Some of them are. Not all of them are, but he also had over 131 of them, so they gave him extra.
Yeah. You'd have spares, wouldn't you? And I'm guessing you'd want to take some brand new ones into the afterlife with you.
I'm assuming so, yes. So we have 131 canes. We also, I mentioned before, lotuses are pain relief. The lotus imagery in his tomb is the most we have ever seen in any tomb of ancient Egypt. They are literally everywhere in that tomb. They're on lamps, they're on the walls, they're on candles, his shoes, his clothing. I mean, they're everywhere.
So the pictorial images in a tomb are really important, right? Because they're personalized. Yes. So if we're seeing a plant that was used for pain relief so often, that really is pointing us in one direction, isn't it?
It really is. And in terms of other evidence from his tomb as well, when Carter originally found his tomb and the furniture in his tomb, his chairs had linen straps on them.
Okay.
Before I came along and looked at things with a disability lens, and again, this really doesn't make sense, and I'm being critical here, is the two theories were these were signs to tell people not to sit in his chairs. Again, this man is a living god. That makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of That's implied, right?
And this other theory was, well, maybe this is how they carried the chairs around. And that, maybe makes a little bit more sense. But if you look again at artistic representations of how they're carrying chairs around, they're carrying them around by the bottom of the chair and there are no straps. And the straps were located on the top part of the chair.
Okay, so we're talking about which is more plausible. They've invented a new way of carrying chairs just for this specific period, or it's actually pointing to being more useful.
What I argue is they are essentially a seatbelt upright on the stairs.
Right. Which,
because
it makes more sense.
They go around, they wrap up here, and they kind of look like a harness.
Okay, and he's a king.
He's a king, yeah.
Again, they're not trying to hide this. This is a part of his presentation.
To a degree, yeah. And what is fascinating talking about his presentation is in terms of the artwork. And again, there are controversial things here, but when you really look at his artwork, he is shown as either sitting down, being carried and supported by those around him, or walking with a cane. There are very rare depictions of him doing things like hunting in a chariot, but other than that, and that's like one or two examples, in all the images we have of him sitting down, being carried by those around him, or being supported by those around him, and that's it.
Okay. And again, thinking about the importance of these pictorial images, I am assuming that if he felt like he needed or wanted to give a different presentation, he could have presented himself as able-bodied, not needing anything, but he's presenting himself in a way that he feels is the most fitting.
To a degree, yes, from what or whoever we compare the artwork to. And when we compare the artwork, and this was the fascinating thing, we think the same artist worked on his tomb that worked on the tomb of Ai, who was the king who took over after him and his advisor. When we have Tut, we have canes. And again, we have people holding him up. When we look at the same artist who did Ai's tomb, we don't have as many canes, and there's none of that let's physically hold him up going on.
Right, okay. Right. So instead of thinking he sat down because he's a king and he can have leisure, when you look at other rulers, if that was the case, you would expect to see it across the board. But you're only seeing it here.
Yes. But again, there are other Egyptologists who have gone through and are like, actually, there are some other depictions of like Pharaoh something sitting down like him. But then if you actually go and look at the sources, these are very, very fragmentary pictorial representations where maybe we have like a couple of bricks left out of the entire image, and they've kind of reconstructed it to be like, yeah, so first that person was sitting, and this has only ever been looked at by like one or two people.
When you see these other scholars who seem to have a vested interest in denying all of the evidence that you're showing me, is this something that you see them denying just when it comes to pharaohs or Egyptians in general? Why do you think they have such a vested interest in presenting able-bodied Egyptians only?
I think it ties back to, this is where the eugenics comes in. The history of the field, our field was founded in part by a eugenicist, Francis Galton, in conjunction with WMF Flinders Petrie, who was Galton's kind of best friend. So there is that thread that has continued down, unfortunately, in the field. And in terms of other evidence that we have from Tutankhamun's tomb too, in terms of these medicinal type things, because I also did a deep dive of like all the botanical remains of his tomb, we have them providing, again, plant materials that are used to treat what we think he had. There's a great deal of them that were pain relief. There were also ones that were fever reducers. And if he died from an infected broken leg, yeah, you're going to need that in the afterlife. But if you look at their placement in the tomb, it meant that no matter where he went in the tomb in the afterlife, he had access to these. The other thing which is fascinating is researchers have looked at his daughters who were found in the tomb with him. This was two stillborn daughters, unfortunately. Depending upon who, again, which Egyptologists believe, these were either twins or one girl was slightly older than the other one, but we don't know. But one of them, again, when you look at her skeletal remains, seems to show signs of having spina bifida. And spina bifida is genetically linked to clubfoot, so that makes sense if he had clubfoot.
Okay.
But again, there are Egyptologists who look at these remains. No, that's embalming error. That's why she has them. And it's like, you can't have it both ways.
That's a lot of embalming errors for someone who's embalming a royal family.
Yes.
The best of the embalming world, I'm assuming.
Theoretically, yes. So it's like, okay, yeah.
I mean, for that argument to stand up, how many embalming errors do we see on mummies of non-elite people?
We don't see that many. Like, this is the thing. It's like, when it's them, it's embalming error. When it's anybody else, oh, it's disability or it's this medical wise.
So this is, I mean, it's very deliberate mangling of what seems to be.
I don't know. I mean, they may be believing that this really truly is embalming error, but again, the exact same wording being used for both, it's just weird.
Right. I mean, it doesn't make as much sense.
No.
Right. Okay.
CT scans, I'm reading the exact quote here. CT scans indicate that the lich pathologies had actually been the result of the embalming process. That's in relation to the daughters. And then if we look at Tut, or an example of him, and this is the thing, is it's the same evidence base too, including therapist Kamasaki and Watsbach. Full body PC scans reveal damage to the king's rib cage and indicate that the curved spine resulted not from disease, but from embalming error. End quote.
Right. I'm going to not say what I'm thinking right now.
Yes.
If the idea of eugenics has been embedded in Egyptology from the start, and it really is, it sounds like you have stepped away from the crowd in really quite a transgressive way and said, hang on a minute, let's look at this differently. Let's look at it with clearer eyes. Why do you think it's taken this long? Why are you the first? Why are there not people before you who are breaking away from the crowd and saying, hang on a minute?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I don't know if it's because there is this tendency, and it's connected to Colin, to kind of worship Howard Carter as the end-all be-all of what Egyptologists should be, even though we know from his practice he was not necessarily the best archaeologist that there was, and had a very vested interest in making money from this discovery. But again, they're just not questioning him. One of the beds, as an example of this, that was found in his tomb is very clearly, if you look at it, and it's not possibility related, but I'm using that as an example of the goddess Taweret. She is a goddess of rebirth, a hippo head, a crocodile tail, and lion legs. It's very, very clear that this is what this is. However, it has been described and identified by Carter as being the goddess Amet, who is a destroyer goddess who has a crocodile head, hippopotamus body, and lion tail. This was not questioned until 2021 by another Egyptologist, which also very early career, Madden Schultz, who came on, took a look at the bed and said, wait a minute, this is very clearly this. This is not this other thing. What is going on here? But it had stood till 2021 because nobody else.
Okay. That's interesting because I think, when I was a very baby undergraduate, like first year, one of the first things I was told was, do not be afraid to question the scholars who have gone before you, because ideas change and they can be wrong sometimes. But here we're looking at the complete opposite. Do not argue with what's gone before.
It seems to be an implicit assumption. We're still using typologies of pottery that were put out by Saunders Petrie in the 1890s in the field. We seem to be very, very slow to progress as a field. And the kind of the in-joke is, we are 20 to 30 years behind everyone else who goes into oral study. So there's that understanding of this. And then in terms of why me, why did I change it? I was disabled in a field that honestly is also not very great. Disability inclusion. So I looked at this evidence and was like, hold on, wait a minute, what is going on here? And did my study of this. This is my first master's degree, and that came about very, very much through circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
I was treated, and I don't mind blaming them, horribly during my first master's degree.
Right.
In terms of disability discrimination and everything else. And their excuse was, well, we've never had a disabled student before, so we don't know what to do with you, so therefore basically just go away. And it was that
Right.
that made me study this, because I was like, wait a minute, this is what's going on with me. And that mummified man who I told you about earlier
Mm-hmm.
was in the museum that was attached to that university. So I was looking at him, looking at me, and just going, wait a minute, what evidence do we have for disabled people in ancient Egypt? So that's where this came from. And it's not just me, it's also other scholars too, who are also very early career and have dealt with similar things in terms of, oh, you can't present at this conference because you studied disability and we don't want you here. And oh, you published this thing on Tutankhamun and we don't want this, etc.
I mean,
yeah.
There are a lot of words that I could be saying to those people, but they're not for polite company.
Yeah, I know. I can't, yeah.
So for those people pushing back, why would you say to them about why it is important, what you are doing, what you are studying, how you are approaching all of this evidence from a new way? Why is it so important that you're doing this?
I think it's important that I'm doing this and others who are now doing this with me. It gives us a more complete picture of what life was actually like in ancient Egypt. Number one, we have a completely incomplete understanding if you look at ancient Egypt from a solely non-disabled perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, we talk all the time about wanting to make the field more inclusive. By shutting this perspective out, you are definitely not making the field inclusive.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, there are disabled, you do have disabled students. And you will be having disabled students. So by shutting this perspective out, you are also saying to these people, we don't want you in this field, you don't belong here.
Academia has been designed to be quite exclusive for a number of marginalized groups. And it is every single time I see a group being marginalized, it makes me angrier. So I'm really happy that I can have this conversation with you and correct some of this narrative that they've been peddling for centuries. Where would you like to see your field move next? What are you planning on for your next big project? Are there some new piles of evidence that you've not looked at yet?
Okay, in terms of evidence and where I'd like to go personally, I would like to use the lens of embodying more and using kind of this disabled perspective more and seeing where we can go. As I said, this is very new. We just last year published the first ever full-length book on disability in ancient Egypt as a subject in 2025, which is, so there's lots of different avenues to go down with this. In terms of what I'm doing and hoping to look at, I'm trying to take a deeper dive on some of the Ptolemaic evidence because there is a lot there that still needs to be unpacked. There is a lot in terms of how we're displaying this material, if we're displaying it at all in the museum context, and how we talk about it. That is doing, and I'm not the only one doing this. There are some other scholars who are doing this, which is great. One of them is Egyptian, which is amazing. So there's evidence for that. There's potentially looking at other disability types because the evidence that we have primarily is all physical disability related, and that's just because the evidence we have. But if someone wants to take a deeper dive into other things like mental illness or diversity, the avenue is there if they want to. There's basically endless possibilities because this is such a new field.
So really, for any students who are listening and who are wondering, where can I work where I am really doing groundbreaking research? I'm not just looking at the same subjects that have been done again and again and again. This sounds like it's a really inspiring place full of potential for creating truly original work.
Yeah, very much so. And there's lots of different avenues that you could take it to. But the thing is, the caveat is you will have to deal with pushback from those who are older in the field, but you can take it.
I mean, I love a bit of pushback. It's why I created the podcast.
Yes.
Okay, so to finish then, if there's one main takeaway that listeners remember from this conversation, what is the main thing that you hope everyone remembers moving forward so that the next time they watch a documentary or read a book, they can keep something in the back of their minds to remember?
Okay. I think in terms of things to remember, A, disability existed in the ancient world in terms of context of Egypt and Greece. And B, disabled people were not necessarily mistreated by societies. It is our modern society that thinks treating people with disabilities badly is okay. And we are imposing our cultural view of that onto the past.
We really should be switching that and taking their lead.
Yes.
Which is, I'm not sure that for every listener listening to this right now, that that's what they were expecting from this conversation. So I am really, really glad that we've been able to show a version of a world that did exist where things were done differently, that we could replicate now if we just changed our minds on a few things.
Yep.
Particularly, I think in this current climate where we will see people with political power and with large platforms try and use ideas from history to promote their own harmful ideas, which we are seeing all the time. We can now, on this topic at least, say, aha, but I know that you're not telling me the truth.
I would say so, yeah.
Which is wonderful. That's so important. Being able to question what we're hearing and to be able to interrogate those who are saying it is such an important skill. So we're really grateful to you for coming on to talk about this. Thank you so, so much. Now, you're the pioneer. So usually I ask people, if you want to know more about a subject, where should you be reading? I mean, I'm guessing it's pretty much your book.
It's my 2 books, and if you like copies of them, just let me know because they're expensive. Because they're academic books. The other scholars to flag in terms of ancient Egypt at this point are Naveen Zakaria, who is the Egyptian lady that I mentioned. And her full name is, just looking her up because she has a middle name and I'm trying to remember what it is right now. And she's doing a lot of really great work on this from a museum perspective and from trying to get an Egyptian reckoning of what this is. It's looking up her full name. It is Naveen Nazar Zakaria is her name. She is currently at Würzburg University in Germany and is also working for the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Cairo. And her most recent article that came out is Unveiling Hidden Histories, Disability in Ancient Egypt and its Impact on Today's Society. How can disability representation in museums challenge societal prejudice? So she's a main scholar. In terms of other Egypt-focused people, there's also Hannah Vogel, who is my co-editor on the one book, but she's also been doing some really great work on disability otherwise. She had, in terms of her publications, I think another must-read publication, I never remember what her name is, Recognizing Inequality, Ableism and Egyptological Approaches to Disability and Bodily Differences, and that's where that definition of disability came from, with her article. And the other main scholar at this point, who has basically shifted away from academia and is just trying to do things full-time in museums now, is Kyle Lewis Jordan. So he doesn't necessarily have as many publications out, but he's trying to do things from a museum perspective.
Yeah, fantastic, because public engagement is so vital. So it's fantastic to see. mean, it's really unusual for a scholar of the ancient world to be able to say, I was there when a new subfield was created. Yeah. So this is
and
amazing.
We're the subfield, and just also so people know, this is still so new. We're trying to figure out what to name them.
Wow, okay.
Stay tuned.
But it's really wonderful that so early in this field's history, you're already reaching out and getting this information out to the public. Thank you so much. It has been an utter pleasure. Huge thank you to Alexandra for coming on to Ancient History 101 to talk about disability in ancient Egypt. Again, just like the discussion that I had with Debbie about disability in ancient Greece, it was thought-provoking, it was surprising, and it's made me think about disability in modern society, how we think about it, how we encounter it, how we experience it. And I hope this conversation has prompted some thought for you too. If it has, let me know. I always love to hear from you. Ancient History 101 is hosted and produced by me, Alexandra Sills. The podcast is part of the Mnemosony Memory Collective, which is your friendly group of history creators, educators, who all have a shared goal of making learning about the ancient world accessible, engaging, and interesting. If you like this show, you should really check out some of our sister shows. Are you subscribed yet? If not, why not? Click that button now so that you never miss any of our episodes. We have a new one every single Wednesday. And you can follow us on social media or our website as well. All of the links are provided in the episode description. That's everything from us this week. We will see you next time for a brand new episode. See you then.